The gas burned for hours. Not somewhere remote, not in a conflict zone most people couldn't find on a map, but at Ras Lufan Industrial City, the single facility responsible for processing roughly 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas supply. Flames lit up the Qatari coastline as emergency crews scrambled and energy traders stared at their screens in disbelief. What had begun weeks earlier as a targeted military operation against Iran's nuclear program had, in a matter of days, become something far more dangerous. A full-scale assault on the infrastructure that keeps the lights on for hundreds of millions of people across Europe and Asia. The question burning through every government briefing room from Washington to Tokyo was the same. How did we get here? And how much worse can this get? To answer that, we need to go back, not just to February 28th, when the bombs first fell, but to a longer chain of decisions, failures, and miscalculations that made this moment almost inevitable. The 2026 war between Israel, the United States, and Iran didn't arrive without warning. It was the product of 3 years of relentless escalation, beginning with the 2023 Hamas-Israel war, which drew Iran's proxy network into sustained confrontation across multiple fronts. That war never truly ended. It evolved. By mid-2025, the conflict had entered a more dangerous phase, with the so-called 12-day war of June 2025, during which the US and Israel launched their first coordinated attempt to physically destroy Iran's nuclear enrichment infrastructure. The operation degraded capabilities but didn't end the program. Iran rebuilt, reinforced, and recalibrated. What followed was a frantic race between diplomacy and military planning. Indirect negotiations were held in Muscat and Geneva throughout late 2025 and into January 2026. The Americans pushed for comprehensive nuclear dismantlement and the cessation of proxy operations across the region. The Iranians demanded security guarantees that Washington was unwilling to provide in writing. Each round of talks produced the same result: a communique, a pause, and then the return of mutual mistrust. Meanwhile, in the streets of Tehran and Isfahan and Shiraz, a new wave of protests had erupted, fueled by years of economic deterioration and the government's brutally familiar response to public dissent. That response, live ammunition, mass arrests, extrajudicial killings, removed whatever remaining political cover existed for continued negotiation on the American side. By late February, the Geneva talks were effectively dead. The U.S. military buildup in the region, already months in the making, had reached a threshold that made the question not whether military action would come, but when. On February 28, 2026, Operation Epic Fury began. The opening hours were unlike anything the region had seen. Precision strikes took out command and control nodes across Iran in rapid succession. Senior IRGC officials were killed in targeted attacks. And in the most dramatic act of the opening phase, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who had presided over 4 decades of theocratic governance and outlasted 8 American presidents, was killed. The pragmatist Ali Larijani, seen by some Western analysts as a potential bridge to a negotiated exit from the crisis, was also assassinated in mid-March strikes. With the 2 figures most capable of either prosecuting or concluding the war now gone, Iran was left in the hands of a leadership council scrambling to maintain coherence, while coalition aircraft continued to fill Iranian skies. The first 2 weeks followed a predictable military logic: decapitate the leadership, degrade the military, and create enough internal instability to force a political transition. Airfields were struck, missile manufacturing facilities were destroyed, drone production sites were reduced to rubble. The coalition was attempting to surgically dismantle the Islamic Republic's ability to project force, gambling that the population, which had shown through years of protest movements that it was capable of sustained resistance to its own government, would seize the moment. The regime didn't collapse. And that is when the strategy shifted in a direction whose consequences are still reverberating across the global economy. If you cannot bring down a government by eliminating its generals and dismantling its symbols of authority, you target something harder to replace: the infrastructure that makes ordinary life possible. The doctrine of economic attrition is not new to military thinking, but the scale at which it was about to be applied in the Gulf would be without modern precedent. The target was South Pars. The South Pars gas field sits in the warm, contested waters of the Persian Gulf, straddling the maritime border between Iran and Qatar. It is the Iranian portion of what is, by a significant margin, the world's largest natural gas deposit. Qatar calls its share the North Field. Together, they hold an estimated 51 trillion cubic meters of gas, a geological fortune that has defined the economic and geopolitical identities of both nations for decades. For Iran, South Pars is not merely an export asset. It generates approximately 80% of the country's electricity and supplies around 70% of its domestic gas. It is, in the most literal sense, the circulatory system of the Iranian state. On Wednesday, March 18, 2026, Israeli aircraft struck it. Precision strikes hit gas storage tanks and critical refinery components at the South Pars complex and at the associated industrial hub at Asaluya. Iranian state television confirmed the hits. 2 major refineries were forced to shut down immediately. Early assessments suggested that sections responsible for nearly 12% of Iran's total gas output had been rendered inoperable. President Trump, responding in a late-night post on Truth Social, described the damage as confined to a relatively small section, language designed to downplay the strategic significance of what had just happened. But inside Iran, the implications were immediately understood. 12% of total gas output in a country already under severe economic pressure and experiencing rolling power shortages is not a manageable disruption. It is the beginning of a humanitarian emergency. And here is where the information war became as consequential as the kinetic one. Within hours of the strike, a striking contradiction emerged between the public narrative offered by Washington and the private reality being reported by credible journalists covering the conflict. Trump's Truth Social post declared that the United States knew nothing about this particular attack, and that Qatar was in no way, shape, or form involved or informed. He framed the Israeli action as a unilateral move out of anger, a country acting on its own frustrations without American knowledge or coordination. The Wall Street Journal and Axios reported a different account entirely. Both outlets, citing senior Israeli and American officials, indicated that the strike had been coordinated with and explicitly approved by the Trump administration. According to those internal briefings, the operation was a deliberate deterrent signal, a calculated move designed to pressure Tehran into reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which Iranian forces had effectively shut down since early March, choking off a corridor through which approximately 20% of globally traded oil normally passes. The discrepancy between the two narratives wasn't accidental. It was constructed. By publicly claiming ignorance while privately directing the operation, the Trump administration was attempting to insulate Qatar, host of Al Udeid Air Base, one of the most strategically critical American military installations in the entire Middle East, from becoming the primary target of the Iranian retaliation that everyone in the room knew was coming. Whether that strategy achieved its protective goal is a question the fires at Ras Lufan answered very quickly. If you're finding this story as significant as it seems, drop your take in the comments. Because the gap between what governments announce publicly and what they're actually coordinating behind closed doors is one of the most important dynamics shaping this conflict. Iran's response to the South Pars strike followed a doctrine that military analysts call expanded deterrence. The logic is deliberate and, in its own terms, internally coherent. If you cannot match the military superiority of your adversary in a direct exchange, you expand the field of consequences. You make the costs of aggression fall not just on the perpetrators, but on every node of the economic system that sustains them. You create a situation where the political cost of continuing exceeds the cost of stopping. Within hours of the Asaliya strikes, the IRGC issued a sweeping public warning through the Tasnim news agency, declaring the energy infrastructure of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar to be direct and legitimate targets. These were not back-channel warnings. They were broadcast publicly to markets and governments simultaneously. The most devastating retaliatory strike came against Ras Lufan Industrial City. Iranian ballistic missiles hit the facility on both Wednesday evening and into the early hours of Thursday morning, causing what Qatar Energy described as extensive damage to the Pearl GTL gas-to-liquids facility and several other LNG processing units. Sizable fires broke out across multiple sections. Emergency response teams deployed in force. The images that emerged: towers of flame visible for miles, columns of smoke rising into the Gulf sky, were not the images of a localized industrial incident. They were the images of a global energy system under direct, deliberate assault. To understand why Ras Lufan occupies such a unique position of vulnerability, consider its role in global supply. The facility processes approximately 1/5 of the world's entire LNG output. Europe, which had spent years since 2022 frantically building alternative supply chains after the Russian gas disruption, had come to depend heavily on Qatari LNG as its most reliable strategic backup. Japan and South Korea, with minimal domestic energy resources, import vast quantities to keep their electrical grids running. When Ras Lufan burns, those countries are not watching the news from a distance. They are running emergency calculations about how long their reserves can sustain their populations. The UAE and Saudi Arabia absorbed their own concentrated wave of attacks in the same cycle. Abu Dhabi authorities shut down the Habshan gas facility and the Bab oil field after intercepting a missile salvo that government officials described as a dangerous escalation. In Saudi Arabia, the Royal Air Defense Forces intercepted 4 ballistic missiles aimed at Riyadh and thwarted a drone strike targeting a major gas processing facility in the eastern province. Kuwait's Mina al-Amadi facility reported fires caused by drone strikes. Evacuation warnings were issued for the Jubail petrochemical complex. Within 24 hours, the entire Gulf energy infrastructure had transitioned from normal operations to active military threat status. The markets registered this reality immediately. Brent crude surged past $110 per barrel following the initial news of the South Pars strike, eventually settling at $113.55, a 5.74% gain in a single trading session. The price had been sitting around $85 per barrel as recently as February 27th, the day before the war began. That is a 34% increase over 3 weeks of conflict, with analysts projecting trajectories approaching $150 per barrel if hostilities continued, a price level that would represent not a temporary spike, but a structural economic shock capable of tipping vulnerable economies into recession. Natural gas markets moved even more violently. In Europe, the TTF benchmark jumped more than 8% on March 18 alone, reaching $55.50 per megawatt hour. By March 19, with the full extent of the Ras Lufan damage becoming clear to traders, European gas prices surged by as much as 28.5% in a single day. In Asia, the JKM spot LNG price for April delivery climbed into the mid-20s per million BTU, the highest level in 3 years, as Japanese and South Korean utilities entered emergency procurement mode, seeking alternative cargoes from Australia, the United States, and anywhere else capable of filling the gap. The International Energy Agency warned that global oil supplies could fall by as much as 8 million barrels per day in March alone, as flows through the Strait of Hormuz collapsed. 8 million barrels per day is roughly 8% of total global consumption, vanishing from the market simultaneously. And yet, in the middle of all of this, there was a new and defiant voice coming out of Tehran. And this is the detail that most coverage has skipped past. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the moment, because what's happening inside the Iranian political structure is arguably the single most important variable in determining whether this conflict finds an exit or spirals further. With Khamenei dead and Larijani also gone, Iran faced a leadership vacuum that could have, in theory, created an opening for political transition. For a brief period, an interim leadership council attempted to manage governance and coordinate the military response. But the vacuum did not produce moderation. In March 2026, Mujtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated supreme leader, was formally named as the new supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. Mujtaba had reportedly been injured in an early coalition airstrike. His first message to the Iranian people was not delivered in a live appearance, but through a news anchor reading his words aloud, a detail that speaks to the extraordinary security precautions now surrounding the regime's surviving leadership. The content of those words left no ambiguity. He ordered the Strait of Hormuz to remain closed. He called for a war of attrition against what he described as the evil empire of the West. He offered no hint of any desire for negotiated resolution. The significance of this succession is profound. Larijani had represented, however imperfectly, a potential off-ramp, a figure sophisticated enough in his understanding of international politics to recognize when the costs of continued conflict exceeded the gains. With Larijani dead and a hardline successor now holding the supreme leader's title, that possibility appears to have been foreclosed. The new Iranian leadership operates under a logic where it perceives itself as having nothing left to lose. A regime fighting for survival, led by a man with a direct personal grievance against the governments that killed his father, is not a regime that responds rationally to economic pressure signals. It is a regime that escalates until either the adversary stops or the state itself ceases to exist. Which is precisely the context in which Trump's ultimatum, issued in the early hours of Thursday, March 19th, must be understood. The statement posted to Truth Social was direct in a way that formal diplomatic communications almost never are. Trump declared that no more attacks will be made by Israel on South Pars, a moratorium explicit and unconditional in its framing, but conditional in its enforcement. Should Iran unwisely choose to strike Qatari energy infrastructure again, Trump warned that the United States, acting with or without the help or consent of Israel, would massively blow up the entirety of the South Pars gas field. He described the scale of potential American force as something Iran has never seen or witnessed before, while simultaneously acknowledging reluctance to authorize such action due to long-term implications for the Iranian people. Consider the weight of what is actually being threatened. South Pars holds more than 14% of the world's proven natural gas reserves. Total destruction of that field would not merely cripple Iran. It would remove from the global energy equation a resource that hundreds of millions of people across dozens of countries depend on for heating, electricity, and industrial production. It would deepen every energy price shock already underway. It would make Iran's post-war reconstruction under any future government a generational challenge. The threat on the table is not a conventional military deterrent. It is an ultimatum framed around an act of destruction with consequences that extend far beyond any single nation's borders. This is the madman theory of deterrence, operating at its most extreme application. threaten something so catastrophic, so disproportionate to any rational calculation, that the adversary concludes non-compliance would produce consequences worse than any conceivable gain. The problem, as every student of deterrence theory eventually confronts, is that it only functions reliably when the adversary has something meaningful to lose and believes the threat will actually be carried out. The current Iranian leadership, by its own public statements and internal logic, believes it has already lost nearly everything. That is not the psychological profile of an actor who responds predictably to escalatory ultimatums. Israeli sources, speaking privately to regional analysts, suggested that while Jerusalem was prepared to observe a temporary operational pause to allow energy markets to stabilize, the broader strategic objectives of the campaign hadn't changed. The Israeli military, they indicated, remained committed to eliminating surviving senior regime figures and further degrading Iran's military capacity. The "no more attacks" pledge in that reading is not a ceasefire. It is a tactical pause, a window to let global market panic subside while the threat of overwhelming American force sits in reserve as the ultimate backstop. Send this to someone who needs to understand what's actually happening in the Gulf right now. Because the convergence of military escalation, energy disruption, and political fragmentation is unlike anything the modern world has witnessed. And it deserves to be understood clearly rather than through political noise. The diplomatic map of the Gulf was also being redrawn in real time. Qatar, for years the careful fulcrum of the region, simultaneously hosting the largest American airbase in the Middle East and maintaining functional relations with Tehran, serving as an interlocutor in conflicts from Gaza to Afghanistan, reached a point of no return. The strike on Ras Lufan was not simply a military attack on infrastructure. It was an attack on the physical source of Qatar's national wealth and its identity as a global energy power. The Qatari Foreign Ministry issued a formal condemnation, describing the strikes as a flagrant violation of sovereignty, and ordered Iranian military attachés to leave the country. For anyone who has followed Gulf geopolitics seriously, the weight of that sentence is difficult to overstate. Qatar and Iran share the world's largest gas field. They have maintained a working relationship through sanctions regimes, through blockades, through years of regional turbulence in which every other Gulf state was aligned against Tehran. The expulsion of Iranian diplomats from Doha is not a tactical maneuver. It is a fundamental and potentially irreversible realignment of Gulf political architecture. Saudi Arabia was reported to be evaluating direct military options against Iran. Oman, the last consistent diplomatic bridge between the Islamic Republic and the Western-aligned Gulf states, was struggling to maintain any meaningful channel. The regional order, painstakingly constructed over years of careful diplomacy, had fractured under the weight of 48 hours of missile strikes. Within the United States itself, fractures were also becoming visible. Joe Kent, director of the National Counterterrorism Center, resigned on March 17th in explicit protest against the war. A senior national security official walking away from his post during active combat operations is not a routine bureaucratic event. It was a quiet but significant signal that the internal American consensus around the operation was less solid than the administration's posture suggested. As the conflict entered its fourth week, the strategic picture resolved into something that defied the clean narratives offered by either side. The coalition had achieved significant military objectives. Khamenei was dead. The IRGC command structure severely degraded. Iran's missile and drone manufacturing capacity substantially reduced. But the regime hadn't collapsed. A new supreme leader had consolidated around the hardest possible line. The Strait of Hormuz remained closed. And the action had spread from a bilateral military campaign into a multi-basin energy crisis, touching every corner of the global economy. The restoration challenge alone is staggering. Large-scale energy infrastructure, refineries, gas processing facilities, LNG terminals, does not come back online in weeks following the kind of precision strikes that hit South Pars and Ras Lufan. Historical precedents from Iraq after 2003 and Ukraine after years of targeted energy strikes consistently show that restoring damaged systems to pre-war output levels takes years, not months, and requires billions of dollars in investment that conflict-affected regions rarely attract while instability persists. For Iran, the March 18th strike may represent the opening of a decade-long energy deficit. For Qatar, the repair of Ras Lufan will test the resilience of even one of the world's wealthiest small states. For Europe and Asia, the lesson arriving in these weeks is the same one that arrived in 2022 and was not fully absorbed. The global energy system is dangerously concentrated around a small number of critical choke points. And when those choke points are treated as military targets, the consequences cascade globally in ways that have nothing to do with who fired the first shot. The world that began February 28th with a targeted military operation against a nuclear program is not the world that exists on March 19th. The boundaries of modern conflict have been redrawn. Energy infrastructure is no longer a neutral backdrop to political disputes. It is the primary battlefield. President Trump's ultimatum attempts to impose structure on that reality, to draw a line that freezes the energy war at its current level while the kinetic campaign continues on other axes. But the underlying forces at work, a new supreme leader with nothing to negotiate away, a shattered Gulf diplomatic order, global markets in sustained shock, are not forces that respond reliably to lines drawn on Truth Social. The gas is still burning at Ras Lufan. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. The tankers that would normally carry a fifth of the world's oil through that narrow passage are rerouted, anchored, or turned back. And somewhere in Tehran, in a location that Israeli intelligence has not yet determined, a new supreme leader who inherited power through the assassination of his father is telling his people, and anyone else who will listen, that Iran has the will to outlast what has been done to it. History has an extensive record of conflicts designed for speed that ended in duration. The 2026 war in the Gulf was planned around the assumption of rapid political transition. What it has produced is a hardened adversary, a fractured regional order, a global economy absorbing an energy shock of historic proportions, and a set of questions that the architects of this campaign will be answering for years. What happens when the infrastructure that sustains modern civilization is treated as a legitimate military target? What happens when deterrence reaches the edge of rational calculus and keeps going? What happens when every party to the conflict concludes it cannot afford to stop? We are living inside the early chapters of the answer, and the final pages have not been written yet.